Our next witness is Jordan Goyet, representing himself. Mr. Goyet. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Goyet. You may proceed.
Hi, can you hear me all right? Hi. Yes, it is. Hi, my name's Jordan Goyet. I'm from Warwick and originally from Pawtucket. And I just wanted to give you all my thoughts on this as you start this process coming up in the next year. And of course, as many people more eloquent than I have said, a big thing to touch on this is transparency and fairness. And I think obviously with a smaller state, so when you're looking at this process, I suggest that you think small. Obviously the communities of interest term has come up a lot, and I think of that often. I think of the different neighborhoods of cities like Providence, like Pawtucket, like East Providence, like Woonsocket, and that in many districts, some of those neighborhoods are contained entirely within one district. Some of them are split in between. I know in my district in Warwick, the entire neighborhood of Buttonwoods is inside my district. Where I live over by also in my state senate district, almost all of the airport, TF Green, is inside of it. And so when you think of communities of interest, I think of neighborhoods, landmarks. Mr. Brace mentioned the zoo. I think that's entirely within Stott Slater's district in District 10 in Providence. And I know, for example, you think of where URI is entirely within Senator Sosnowski's district. And so when I think you're doing this process is that when you go around the state, you hear from different communities that they don't want to be broken up. They don't want to suddenly find that because they live on one side of a street, that the street's going to be split in half and they're going to end up in a different district. As you've heard from Mr. Brace as well, that sometimes when you look at the census data, it's different from what the town actually says as to what the boundaries of the different cities and states are. And so I feel like that's most important to a lot of communities, and especially we've heard about the massive growth in minority population in the state, especially on the Hispanics in the last decade. I think it grew almost 20% in the last decade. I think when you go through this process, it was almost entirely, much of the growth was in Providence County, where cities like Central Falls, Pawtucket, Providence are located, and that those areas, when you're doing the maps, that those new populations, all the new Hispanic community members, Black, Brown community members, get the representation they deserve now, that they are becoming such a increasingly growing portion of our population and your electorates. And finally, just to close out, I know a lot has been said during in anticipation of this process of the politics of it. And I know something like this, we don't want politics to be involved in it. It's a operational thing we have to do, but it's inherently in it in something like this when we have legislators, former legislators that have been on the process before and such, that are redrawing the maps of who their voters will be, who other legislators' voters will be. Much as some comments have been made, this process is used to reward certain people and punish others. I hope as you go through this process that you do the work to dispel a lot of that talk as much as possible. As we've seen through the years in the 80s, when the state sued over that, and let's say Senate elections had to be delayed a year, and the Senator Metz mentioned the court case that he sued the state over to get minority representation, more minority representation in the state. And the last round of redistricting, where a lot of comments were made over how some certain districts were drafted. So I hope as you go through this process that obviously transparency, fairness, equity are apparent throughout this whole procedure that you go through, and that the maps that come out do not crack districts in half. Like obviously I know in Senate District 22, Smithfield is entirely located within that district. It would be very notable if Smith cracked in half and then that's around redistricting. And that another point of gerrymandering that often comes up, some people are packed into districts. And I know in a case in Virginia, when their maps were recently drafted, they'll allow some reasons why they had to be were that some people were on one side of the street, living on one side of the street, and they were in a totally different district, and the people on the other side of the street. That's how bad the maps were. So that's pretty much all I have to say. Not as much of an expert as Mr. Marion or some of the other people who have spoken before, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Goyet. Senator Metz has a question for you.
Yes, I want to thank you for your testimony. You sounded pretty professional to me. You had me
Thank you,
fooled.
sir.
But I want to thank you for your testimony. And as an observer I'd say from the 80s, when I was a representative, I had one street that had three representatives. And I believe it was Moore Street years ago. But the process has improved. And based on the lawsuit, one of the things that I'll never forget as an elected official that's community-based, when after the lawsuit was settled out of court, and for me, it would have been a miracle if one senator agreed to change their boundaries to create the former Senate District 6 that I formerly represented. Well, it was either 8 or 10 senators that agreed to change the boundaries to create a district for an African American, and I'll never forget it. So I want to, yes, it's not a perfect system. It's going to be very challenging to have the transparency and the fairness that you're talking about. But for me, that was a defining moment for me to see us moving more and more towards fairness. And that's our challenge, to make sure that we continue in that process. But thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Rep. Newberry.
Thank you. I want to just say I thank you for your testimony as well. I agree with a lot of what you had to say, and a lot of what Senator Metz said. I just want to make one point. It's more for the general public, because I've been through this process before. In fact, I was involved with a lawsuit against the last time this process went through. So
I know what you mean.
there has to be boundaries somewhere. I cannot tell you how many times when I've walked my district at election time and I've talked to voters who live on the boundary and they're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Somebody has to live on the edge. So we
Yeah.
do have to remember that. There's no perfect solution. I just want to point that out to everybody watching. There's going to be some oddities. It's just part of the process. The key is figure out which ones are just inevitable versus the ones that are shenanigans, shall we say.
Yeah, of course.
That's a great point. Thank you, Rep. Senator Dela Cruz.
Mr. Mayor, so I got lots of emails from you, so it's nice to put a face to the name.
Thank you.
And I appreciate both of you and my emails, because I know you guys are the information. I think that's really important, so.
Thank you.
I'm hoping through the process that maybe Republicans can pick up a few more seats, talk about gerrymandering, and I think that we can probably gain a few more seats, so we'll see what happens, but thank you for testifying. I appreciate it.
Sure, we'll see.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Goyet, you did a fine job. Don't
Thank
sell
you,
yourself
sir.
short. Very articulate and on your A game. Thank you very much. Any more questions? No, thank you.